You can flip to 1 Corinthians 4 to start. I'm going to do a little recap of what we talked about yesterday because I know guys are coming in and out, so we want to be on the same page here. So we'll start in 1 Corinthians 4, and while you're getting there, let me recap yesterday, and then I want to answer a question that was raised at the baseball game last night, which I answered at the baseball game, but I think it was a good question. It's valuable for everybody to think a little bit about. So just to recap, what we did yesterday was 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and we looked at the two passages, those are listed on your outline, where Paul commands imitation or discusses someone imitating him. So in 1 Thessalonians, it's more of a retrospective about how the Thessalonians have imitated him and his co-workers and also the churches in Judea. In 2 Thessalonians, it was a command to imitate, and that command involved the distinctive way of life that he brought with him when he brought them the gospel, being specifically the fact that he worked in order to provide for the proclamation of the gospel. And there are people in Thessalonica by the second letter who are not working. And he says that they must, it is necessary for them to imitate him in working to provide for their own bread. So that's 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. If you guys have residual questions about that, we have until noon. I'm not going to talk straight until noon. We're going to take a break. I'm going to rely on Greg to let me know when to, let off the gas, and we'll take a break for a little while, and then we'll come back and go up to noon. But do you guys have residual questions left over from yesterday before I talk about the one that was raised about how a lot of this connects to the rest of the Bible? Anything you can think of? Okay. If you think of it, just bring it up. We can run it as a free discussion. The one that came up was, how does this relate to the Old Testament? And if you look in the Old Testament, you will not find the language of imitation. It's not there. Okay. If you have a copy of the Bible that has the Apocrypha in it, you will find the language of imitation in two places. One is the book of Wisdom, and the other is 4th Maccabees. Not 1, 2, or 3, but 4. Okay. In Wisdom, the discussion of imitation is pretty straightforward. It's about how things that are made imitate their models. It's, for instance, used to discuss how idolaters imitate things when they're making them with their hands, or these are the mere imitations of real things. 4th Maccabees is interesting and lines up, and then I promise I'll go back to what's actually in the Bible in the Old Testament, okay? But 4th Maccabees is interesting because there is a command in 4th Maccabees to imitate me. And it comes out of the mouth of one of the Maccabees. So the story of the Maccabees, they're resisting Hellenization, they're resisting giving up on the law and circumcision in the time between the Testaments. And as they're resisting, 7 brothers are killed all together on the same day, and then their mother does not mourn their death, but instead praises them for their steadfastness. It looks a lot like, and they even refer to, the steadfastness of the 3 young men in Daniel. Okay. One of the brothers, as he is going to his death, says to his brothers, imitate me. And what he means is, imitate my steadfastness, go to your martyrdom, do not flinch, do what I do. Imitate me, he says. And as you probably know, those books, those apocryphal books, are written originally in Greek, most of them. Jesus Ben Sira is written in Hebrew and then translated, right? But most of them are written in Greek. 4th Maccabees is very Greek. Okay. So that's where you get the language of imitation. It's kind of a Greek cultural term available if you speak Greek. That kind of leaves out the Old Testament. So you're not going to find the language of imitation in the Old Testament, but you will find the concept. The concept, however, is phrased differently. It's usually phrased in terms of be as I am. Most famously, Leviticus 19, be holy, as I, the Lord your God, am holy. Or the language concerns following, and along with following, walking in a way. Sometimes those ways are something to do with a family specifically. So think about the command in Deuteronomy 6 to teach your children the faith. That concerns walking, as you walk along the way, then you teach. So it conveys a certain, what we might call in modern American English, a lifestyle, or a way of life, or a way of being, or just how we do things. But the language that the Old Testament uses is walking, following, and ways. And there are many passages throughout the Old Testament that talk about following and ways, especially the Lord's ways. The clearest example that you're probably going to find, and if you go home and you read this, you'll see it all over the place because you're now like your antennae are up, you're looking for it, is that when you read 1st and 2nd Kings, you'll see that kings are evaluated in terms of following or not following, either the way of the Lord or, for instance, the sin of Jeroboam, right, in the case of the northern kingdom. So you find that all over the place, especially when someone's entire life is being evaluated. Did he follow the ways of the Lord? Was he walking in the way of the Lord? Or was he walking in, sometimes the phrase even is said this way, walking in the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, right? So that's where you're going to find it most often. It occurs several times in Deuteronomy. So it's mostly in the books of Moses and then also the historical books, especially Kings, and there's a couple instances in 2nd Chronicles. That language of following, walking in a way, walking after, is not generally what appears in Paul, but it does appear all over the Gospels. Okay? So if you read the Gospels, you're going to find this language, and then they use the Greek word disciple, mathetes, to indicate somebody who is following, right? So usually the Old Testament, whether in Hebrew or the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, doesn't pick up on mathetes. It doesn't call people disciples. But this concept of following that is in the Old Testament is then summed up in the Gospels, especially Matthew, as being a disciple of Jesus. That means to follow after him, to walk in his ways. Or, as Paul says at the end of Romans explicitly, imitating Christ. Okay? The reason I think all of this kind of works the way it does, and the language changes, but the concepts don't necessarily, is because Paul is a missionary. One of our big takeaways from yesterday is that Paul is engaged in spreading the gospel, especially to a culture that does not already have the gospel. And maybe you've had the experience of reading Paul, especially in a place like, let's say, 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. Okay? You think about that passage, some of those biblical references are somewhat difficult to pick up on sometimes, even for people who are reading the Bible in their own native language, and they are, this is the 18th time they've heard this, and Paul is saying, and the rock was Christ. And you're like, okay, people are not quite sure what all of that means. So sometimes you might think, well, Paul is not trying very hard to make this stuff immediately understandable. What I find in his method is that Paul will use culturally applicable, relevant, understandable terms like imitation that are not necessarily biblical terms, right? So he'll use terminology and then he will infuse the culturally comprehensible terminology with biblical content. And that's exactly what he's doing with imitation, where it's not really a term available to him biblically. It's not a term that he can expect people to be familiar with biblically, but it's one that they know culturally. And he takes the biblical concept of following, discipleship, and he infuses all of that into imitation, a word they already know. Okay? So he is choosing his terms in culturally specific ways to deliver a message which is not culturally specific, which is obviously the gospel. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the Old Testament or 4th Maccabees, if you're a big 4th Maccabees aficionado, before we go into 1 Corinthians? If you want historical content, do 1st and 2nd Maccabees. 4th Maccabees is kind of, that's like, some people appreciated the baseball game last night, some people didn't. 4th Maccabees is the guy that has the Bill James historical abstract, right? That's 4th Maccabees, okay? All right. Now that was esoteric. I've turned most people off by making that reference. That's okay, yeah. Any questions about this Old Testament following idea? It's very familiar from the Gospels, right? So.
Yeah. Could you almost then apply that maybe to the Elijah-Elisha relationship kind of thing? That's good.
Yeah, Elijah and Elisha are a very good example of following. And one of the things about following or imitation is that Elisha knows that at the outset, he knows that he has to follow, but he does not know all the content of what that entails. It's kind of like being a pastor, right? On your ordination day, or when you get married, right? You're swearing to a wide variety of things. In fact, stuff that's going to affect every day of the rest of your life. You don't know what you're signing up for good and for bad. You don't know. And things that we're talking about, concepts like following or discipleship or imitation, are very similar. They're clear in the orientation you need to have. They're not always clear in step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then you'll have the Lego built by the time you get to the end of the steps. It's not all clearly laid out that way. Yeah. Go ahead, Paul. Paul asked the question, by the way. Kudos to Paul.
So I was thinking about Proverbs also.
Yeah.
Hear, my son, your father's instruction, forsake not your mother's teaching.
Yeah.
You could multiply examples like that. How does that connect?
Yeah. That's going to link up really well with 1 Corinthians 4 because Paul will describe himself as a father to the Corinthians. And I think when we're talking about, I hope to tee something up for Eric after lunch, when you're talking about things like the third use of the law, the context for the third use of the law in both Paul and also in Proverbs is a pre-existent relationship of care, right? It's not an abstraction issued from some random source, like when you find out that the IRS rewrote its rules and now you got to take down your pastor's parking sign. The IRS doesn't care about you. I know this is not news to anybody. The IRS doesn't care about you, and they'll change the rules and they're not going to tell you. You're going to have to find out. The third use of the law is not given that way. Admonition is not given that way. It's given within these contexts of teacher, student, father, son. And that is especially all over Proverbs. Because it is notable, this is just kind of a more generic way of saying it, it is notable how not uncomfortable, how utterly comfortable Paul is in issuing advice and admonition. And he doesn't do the caveats that I often hear in our circles about, I'm going to tell you this, but it doesn't affect your salvation. He just says it. Right? So the question that I've often wondered about is, why does Paul feel so comfortable? And I think one of the reasons he's comfortable is because he's comfortable in his relationship to his hearers. There's not a running possibility of massive offense or confusion. In the same way that if my dad, tells me my dad and I like to garden together, right? So if my dad tells me, go get the tiller and gas it up, I'm not going to say like, who are you to tell me? Or, I just do what my dad tells me to do. That's, he's not trying to harm me. I just need to go do this for him. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Adam. Nice. This guy has a great first name, by the way. So yeah, go ahead.
You talked yesterday about some of Paul's practical application, what this meant.
Yeah.
Will you later today get into, for us as pastors, I know our discipleship can sometimes be very information heavy. Let me just teach you what we know, as opposed to, hey, follow me and how I'm living and what I'm doing and what I'm about. Will you get into some of that later?
Yeah, I want to. It makes me uncomfortable because I think it concerns issues of scale and programming that I think every pastor deals with. At what scale is something sustainable? Let's jump into 1 Corinthians 4 and then we'll talk about this because Paul makes this distinction between teacher, you could get information lots of places, versus father. Okay? So let's jump in. That's a great question. Let's jump into 1 Corinthians 4. And we talked at the very end of yesterday's session about the issue of unity being huge in Corinth. people attaching themselves to different teachers, Paul, Apollos, Cephas. Maybe some belong to something called a Christ faction. That's always kind of the trump card, right? Well, you like Luther and you like Wesley. Well, I like Christ, So those guys win. But in 1 Corinthians 4, Paul, I'm going to start at verse 14. Paul is writing to them, and he's going to clarify what the relationships are. So he says that he's not writing these things to trip them up or to put an offense in their way, but as his beloved children, he counsels them. That word nuthito is the word from which we usually get counseling. He'll clarify that. So let's just read a little further. For if it is the case that you have, and if you have the Greek available to you, you can see the word myriad is in there. You have, as it were, myriads of pedagogues. A pedagogue being a person who is usually a slave and leads you from your house to your school. Okay, the law is called a pedagogue by Paul in Galatians. You have myriads of pedagogues in Christ, but you do not have many fathers in Christ Jesus. For in Christ Jesus, through the gospel, I became your father. If you look at the end of 15, if you have the Greek, you can see that he uses the first person singular pronoun, ego, which he doesn't have to do. So when you see that, you can tell that he is emphasizing, as it were, underlining the word I. I became your father through the gospel. This is a very particular relationship, which is not the same thing as having information about Christ, right? Because the pedagogues it's not just kind of information that they're getting from some ancient version of the internet, like how to install drywall, right? It is information about Christ. You have many teachers in Christ Jesus. But I became your father. This relationship, I think, relates to something that I mentioned yesterday about the singular importance of people who shape your faith at different times, right? So if you're a pastor, you went to seminary and you had many different teachers, right? On whatever faculty, right? It may be that one of those or two of those have been uniquely important in your life, or it may be the case that none of those was really particularly important because you were simply being taught. But the person who has shaped most deeply your outlook on life may be, even as a Christian, could be anybody. Okay? It's not necessarily somebody who simply gives you the most or the best constructed amount of information. So there's a distinction that Paul is drawing here through a relationship formed by the proclamation of the gospel versus information. And let's be clear, information is not bad, it's just not the same thing. Okay? It's just not the same thing. When I think about stuff like retention or discipleship, right? I think about this constantly. And this is just personally speaking, so this is not exegetical. You can completely disagree with this if you want to. I dropped classes. I do a lot of teaching, but I do it only one-on-one or me if a family is coming in at the same time with the family. I did this for two reasons. One, the people were just too all over the place in their questions and experiences for me to, if I have somebody coming from the ELCA, it's a completely different situation than somebody that's never been a Christian before, okay? So the person coming from the ELCA wants to know about inerrancy, wants to know about women's ordination, wants to know about communion practices. The person coming from nothing wants to know, well, how do I know that God exists? Okay, so that enabled me to individualize a lot more. The other thing that it gave me is a relationship to them, not only as their teacher, but also as, you could say, their pastor, or especially when the person is coming in from nothing, as a kind of father, because they know Christianity through me, which is humbling and crazy, but it is the case. And so that gave me the ability to connect to them. I have about 135 people in church on Sunday, one service. And I worry about scale with things like that, right? Now, I didn't bring in all of those people, but I brought in a number of them. And I worry what would happen if we ever got to 200. I think Paul's going to address the issue of transmissibility, but I think that this notion of discipleship or imitation involves an actual personal connection to some human being. It cannot just be, I got the correct information, now I'm in. That is something that I took away, and I actually changed what I do based on what I've understood from what he's doing. Okay. Let me talk about transmissibility, and then if you guys want to talk, you want to ask more about that, we can do that. So he's going to go on to say, I exhort you, this is in 16, I exhort you, I encourage you, therefore, to become my imitators, right? So it's a noun here, mimitemu, to become my imitators. So this is different from 1 Thessalonians because they're not already imitators. And we know that imitation has to do with a way of life conducive to the gospel. And conducive is a word that I use very importantly because it's not like Paul is going out and proclaiming Paul. He's proclaiming Christ, and he is living in a way which makes that gospel carry quickly through him. He himself becomes conducive, right? And he's saying your way of life, which involves disunity and pride in Corinth, which has then, all of these insane all this kind of crazy fallout in Corinth. I mean, Corinth is just kind of a laundry list of insanities, one after the other. That is not conducive to the gospel. So you become my imitators. In 16, on this account, I send to you Timothy. Now, this is the transmissibility question. And it's a question that I think every pastor thinks about because even when you see growth, you've read the parable of the sower, and you know that this stuff could be scorched or it could be choked, okay? So you think, like, how can we make sure that we have that the growth that is going on in this person or this family or whatever, this entire congregation, can continue to happen, right? I sent to you Timothy, who is my beloved child. You see the echo there of 14. He says, Timothy is my beloved child. You are my beloved children in 14. So there's an identity between Timothy and the congregation. Timothy's not coming to them as somebody who's completely foreign or strange. He's coming to them. They share this common identity of being Paul's beloved children. So they have that relationship. But he's beloved, and there's a crucial kind of twist on this. He's beloved and faithful in the Lord. For he will remind you, and here's your link up with this Old Testament vocabulary, he will remind you, it's the same word for do this in remembrance of me, anamnesis. He will remind you of my ways in Christ Jesus. So I do things in a certain way. I have certain ways that I walk in. Those are what you follow, or those are what you hear, imitate. And he will remind you of them. So what is needing to be conveyed can be conveyed by somebody else. I've heard pastors talk about it in this way that, sometimes it's kind of a joke because it's eschatological, but it's, I'm trying to work myself out of a job, right? Or I tell my people, in heaven, I won't need to do this job. Right? I'm trying to get you guys to a place where my job is irrelevant. Okay? And imitation is not different from that because Paul is not doing imitation. He's not talking about imitation so that they can be attached to Paul. He's already disavowed that earlier in the letter. These are his ways in Christ Jesus, which Timothy can convey to them. Paul doesn't even need to come himself.
So what he's saying is imitate the imitator.
Yeah.
Timothy is imitating Paul, and so Timothy's going there so they can see what imitating Paul looks like. If they imitate Timothy, they're imitating Paul.
That's right. You can pass this on. And I think I think it's the kind of thing that you don't appreciate until it's not there. When, I don't know how much you guys have interaction with clergy of lots of different denominations, but something that I always find interesting is that clergy in other denominations often don't have any seminary education whatsoever, depending on the denomination, or their education is very diffuse. You can go anywhere to get, you just need an MDiv or a bachelor's in Bible or something, and then you can get going. So they have very few experiences in common with each other. I think something like, I would say this is a way of life in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, is that we are supposed to have experiences in common with each other. And it's a kind of thing where you don't appreciate it until it's not there anymore. And then you learn how valuable it is to have all of these things in common with each other. Even if it is just the fact that a lot of us, guilty as charged, but I'm not in this district, which is why I'm admitting this, have not submitted our parochial reports yet, right? Okay, so that's part of our ways together. And these are things that a lot of times, these ways of life, like that we have seminaries, that we do things in common, that we have certain classes that we have to take, these are things that are set up generations ago. If they disappeared, we would notice. Sometimes ways in Christ that are really helpful and conducive, you don't notice until they're gone. You don't realize, and I think you can see this if you experience a member moving away or dying who was very active, very faithful, very helpful, and then you realize all the ways in which not only was that person so helpful, but also they brought a certain energy, a certain love, a certain gift, and now that that's gone, you really miss that. Yeah. So, but those things are transmissible because those kinds of people or those institutions have effects on others that those people might not even realize until they are gone. Yeah. Adam, if I'm not answering your question, just interrupt me again. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying. I'm trying because I think a lot about that. Yeah. So he says, he will remind you of my ways in Christ Jesus. Just as everywhere in all the churches I teach, or in every church, you might say, I teach. So there is a connection here between teaching, right? We said information is not bad, but information also has personal implications and a personal reminder in Timothy, such that Paul could not simply send a book. He can't just write it all down and then say, okay, read this, and now you're good. But in every church, he does teach these ways. And the every church caveat is a huge one. It's going to come up again in chapter 11, because it has to do with a term that we summarized in 1 Thessalonians as Catholicity. That is that anywhere you go, you'll find it. Kind of like when you see that cross that doesn't quite meet, it's like 3 crosses put together and it doesn't quite meet. You know exactly where you are? You know? Yeah, home. That's right. That's right. Yeah, right. It's in every church somewhere, somehow. Yeah. But it's not a logo, it's a certain way that Paul has that he is conveying to everybody everywhere. Okay. You want to ask or say more about that, or do you want to talk more about fatherhood? I think there's a lot to say about fatherhood. Alex? Fatherhood, okay. I'll bookmark that, yeah.
Maybe you'll talk about it later, but just these ways, do we have any reference to what specifically? Because we don't have Timothy, right? And remind us of what ways are we talking about.
Yeah, I think the content of the ways is, some of it is unclear because of the historical distance, and he doesn't spell it all out. But I think a lot of them, to go back to a point that I made yesterday, is when Paul is talking about himself, he's not doing that to inform them. Like, it's not just a here's what I've been doing lately, or let me show you that I'm actually doing my job. I've been here and there, and I did this visit, and this kind of. He's talking about himself to model for them how they also ought to understand things or be or think. So like in Philippians, and we'll get there a little closer to lunch, in Philippians, when he does say, what you have seen and heard and observed in me, practice these things, he'll say, basically, if you're not sure what that is, you'll figure it out. So it's always kind of nebulous because it is historically limited, and he doesn't tell people that he doesn't personally know to imitate him. But the places that you can find are the places where Paul is describing either his own practice in the first person, or sometimes it's in connection with imitation. Like in 2 Thessalonians, it's you need to work to provide your own bread. So that's really specific. But a place where it's not specific, but it does sort of make sense that you would do things this way, is when in 2 Corinthians he describes himself as a kind of theater to the world of suffering. Or we are the stench of death to those perishing, but the stench of life unto life for those who are being saved. That relationship to the world, where the world hates you, but the believers love your message and are looking for you, is therefore it's paradigmatic. Yeah, it's because this is happening to me, it's also going to happen to you. So I would look for places where Paul describes his own life, his own ways, how he raises money. Providing for himself in certain cases, these kinds of things. Those self-descriptions are really where you're going to find Paul's ways. But usually he's not saying, I got 5 ways, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, go for it. Because it is harder to communicate all of that without a person, which is why I think the role of people in discipleship is so huge. Because ultimately that person is modeling for me what it means to be a Christian. In addition to the beliefs that we have in common, there is the life that we have in common, which is even more than could be put into a book. Let's talk a little bit about fatherhood. Fatherhood here means that he is telling them a certain way to be, because fathers, as we talked about from Proverbs, fathers are scripturally those who are raising children in fear and admonition of the Lord. So this concept of wisdom is a concept that then lives within that relationship of the father. It's not just information. It's not that I could come to one of your churches on Sunday and I could preach the sermon and do the service. I know how to do that, but it's not the same as when you do it. Yeah. I think that people have asked me who I thought was the best preacher in the church. After I said myself, then I said, that's bad. No, I said it's some pastor who said exactly what needed to be said some Sunday in an obscure place that had 65 people in attendance. That's the best sermon. Because the fitness of the message of the Lord relies on these personal relationships. It does not rely on some objective standard of excellence, like the guy just had great eye contact the whole time and it was put together so well. And that's fine. And I think that those kind of standards for our own practice are good, but I don't think that determines what is, quote, best. Because scripturally, best is not only a certain standard of behavior, it's also a fitness or appropriateness of what needs to be said to someone at some time. And that relies on relationship. That does not rely on this guy's he got the A+ in homiletics, and he's just been just destroying the competition since then. It's not making the playoffs, right? Yeah. Okay. So I think that relies on fatherhood. I think the other thing about fatherhood is that the relationship of fatherhood is not something that Paul claims, even with all the congregations that he knows. And the Corinthians are, in that regard, unique, such that I do not know that fatherhood, you think about this with a concept like pastoral tenure. it's easy for me to see how fatherhood could happen over 10 years. It's really hard to see how it happens in 10 months. Right. And we kind of intuitively know that. I just want to kind of put a label on that. And this is something that when I talked to my district's mission exec, I said, I think I figured out from the Bible why it is that congregations take on their pastor's personality. And I said, I think it's because the pastor basically becomes their dad, and it's like certain families that, they always go camping, or they always go somewhere on vacation, or that's what they do because that's what dad does. And he said, yeah, you were right, but I already knew that. Okay, that's good. That's fine. But I think this is one reason why, is because the relationship shifts over time from one of information, which we're all given roughly the same information, and I know we all do all the reading in seminary, so we all have exactly the same information up here, right? So we can all download, we can all give them information. It's not the information that makes a father. It's not a certain amount of information. Yeah. Okay. You want to say more about fatherhood or ask anything about that? Or? Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
Paul didn't have a very long tenure with Timothy. Yeah. Like Corinth was one of the longest, and that was a couple of years.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Paul was like these pastors, if you've ever, I don't know how much you've ever read about, guys. It seemed like about 100 years ago, if you got a call, you left. I'm talking about our church. I'm not talking about Paul. You got a call, you went. I've talked to many people who said, my grandfather served at 13 churches or something, because he got calls and he just went. I don't think it has everything to do with tenure. I think with Paul, the issue is he is the one who introduced Christianity to them, which is an incredibly powerful relationship that does not require tenure. It simply requires existence to have that kind of relationship. I think when you're dealing with a congregation which has, let's say, existed for 50 years when you get there and you're there for 12 years, and the people in the congregation, not all of them have come in under your tenure and they had pastors before, you're not in that same relationship of fatherhood necessarily that Paul is for people who know Christianity and know church because of Paul. Yeah, that is different. Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
So going to transmissibility once more, and stop me when you need. So you have 135 people in your church. You can't be the father to all of them the way they each need a father. So the process of pouring into Timothy and saying, hey, Timothy, go so they can imitate you, takes a lot of time, a lot of work. How do you see Paul balancing, as he's constantly going from one place to the next, balancing the need to keep pouring into Timothy or this one, but also recognize there's more to do beyond that?
Yeah, that's really good. I think that the issue of transmissibility became clearer for me when we started the church plant, because in the church plant we had no pre-existent ways of doing things or programs. Now, we all had ideas about ways of doing things because we had been in some church before, most of us. But all of that was shaped by the relationships that we had with one another as people, and not so much by the stuff that we had inherited. In that context, it's much easier to say, okay, I'm going to teach you how to run the altar guild without freaking out about things. And then you'll be able to teach 5 other people to do that, and we could do that. And the reason we could do that was because it was all dependent on, I'm going to call you, we're going to get together, then you're going to call these 5 people and you're going to get together with them. I think a lot of times transmissibility is harder the more stuff that you have sitting on top of the interpersonal connections. It's not like it makes it impossible. I think that we have a large machinery for producing pastors, for instance, in our denomination. I think we still have personal transmissibility of certain ways that guys pick up at seminary from different this or that professor. But I think the more you have sitting on top of it, the harder it becomes. it can even be something that is, I think, good, but then can become bad in that somebody's having a lot of trouble with something, and they want to talk to somebody else because they don't want to upset the pastor. But if I love you and we have that personal connection, I actually want to know about that. I don't want you to tell 3 other people who can't really help you when I can help you, So I think that the more stuff that you have sitting on top, which you have in anything that's been around for longer than 5 seconds, that's the way it works. So I have not only because of the church plan, I went to something that I learned from Tom Rainer called zero-based time budgeting. So zero-based budget is basically you ask yourself, it's usually like with money, you ask yourself when you're making the budget for each year, is this a cent that I absolutely need to spend? And that's how you make decisions. But I started doing the same thing with time because of the church plan, because I realized things could just be much simpler. So we have pretty much deprogrammed the established church because of what we did with the newly established church. Yeah. And I think that has helped make things more transmissible, because now if people ask me a question, I tell them a person and not a thing or a meeting time or something, and they go to the person. And the person is actually responsible for doing something rather than just holding a meeting that will happen regardless of whether 10 or 2 people show up. Let me just set up 1 Corinthians 11. This is the end of an argument. 1 Corinthians 11:1 is the very end of a discussion of what to do about meat sacrificed to idols that started at the beginning of chapter 8. And that might seem esoteric, but like we talked about yesterday, it's these really seemingly mundane, quote, practical issues that show you what people actually believe and what they actually do and what they actually think by virtue of how they behave. And the issue that Paul's dealing with is not the abstract issue of should you run into pagan temples and seek to participate in everything they're doing. Everybody knows that's wrong. The issue involves, if I happen to be with somebody, does it really matter because I don't believe in these pagan gods, they're not real. And those are the party that Paul will refer to as the strong. And then there are the weak who have just escaped paganism, and they see the strong eating meat sacrificed to idols, and the strong know what they're doing, and abstractly considered they're not wrong because the pagan gods are indeed nothing. But should they do that when the weak are watching? Okay? So we'll talk about Paul's example and what he brings up. We'll do that after the break.